Victor Langford thought this emergency board meeting would end with careers destroyed, but he had no idea it would begin the collapse of his own arrogance. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, and if you believe people should be judged by character, not appearance, hit like and subscribe. Because stories like this remind us exactly how expensive pride can become. Now, back to Claire Whitman. The 42nd floor of Langford Global Holdings looked less like an office and more like a monument to power. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked downtown Chicago, polished marble reflected the gray morning light, and a 20-foot conference table was lined with executives in tailored navy suits, Swiss watches, and expressions that had long forgotten humility. On the far end of that room, almost hidden beside the silver coffee station and a stack of untouched presentation folders, sat Claire Whitman. Gray cardigan. Plain white blouse. A laptop that looked older than some of the interns. At 37, Claire had perfected the art of becoming invisible in rooms where money did the talking. She was technically a temporary operations consultant, hired 3 weeks earlier to help reconcile shipping reports after a failed software migration, but no one in this building seemed to remember that title. To most of the senior staff, she was simply the quiet woman who typed notes and kept her eyes down. And this morning, with the company hemorrhaging nearly $100 million in frozen contracts, delayed cargo, and furious overseas clients, invisible was exactly how Victor Langford expected her to remain. Victor entered the boardroom without greeting anyone. His Italian leather shoes struck the marble with sharp authority, and every whispered side conversation died instantly. At 52, Langford carried the kind of billionaire confidence that made other men sit straighter. Silver at his temples. Dark tailored suit. A platinum watch worth more than Claire's sedan. His jaw was tight enough to cut glass. He threw a thick financial report across the conference table, and the paper slid like a warning shot. $100 million, he said, his voice low but lethal. That is what this company is projected to lose in the next 72 hours unless one of you highly compensated geniuses explains why our entire global distribution chain is collapsing. No one moved. Not the CFO. Not the logistics chief. Not the Harvard analyst staring at spreadsheets like they might suddenly become useful. Outside the windows, Chicago traffic crawled through the rain. Inside, the silence pressed down heavier than the storm clouds. Victor began pacing slowly behind the chairs, each step measured, each breath sharpened by rage. We have 12 cargo ports delayed, 36 retailers threatening breach of contract, and investors asking if I've lost control of my own company. He stopped and slammed his palm against the polished table. So talk. One executive cleared his throat and launched into a trembling explanation about software latency. Another blamed customs delays in Long Beach. A third suggested foreign labor shortages. Victor dismissed each one with a colder stare than the last. None of them had answers. None of them had control. And with every failed explanation, the room shrank deeper into humiliation. Claire quietly continued typing. Not fast. Not nervous. Just steady. Her eyes moved from the giant loss projections on the wall screen to the printed routing summaries in front of the vice president of logistics. She noticed something. A decimal discrepancy. Tiny. Almost laughably tiny. But Claire's fingers paused above her keyboard. Victor turned at that exact moment, scanning the room like a man looking for someone else to blame, and his eyes landed on the plain woman near the coffee station. He frowned. Then, with the cruel amusement of a man who enjoyed public embarrassment, he gave a short laugh. Well, he said, gesturing toward Claire as several executives turned to look, at least someone seems busy. Tell me, sweetheart, are you taking notes, or are you about to solve a $100 million disaster? The boardroom erupted in nervous laughter, and for the first time that morning, every eye in the room fixed on Claire Whitman. Claire did not answer. Immediately, and that made the laughter spread wider. A few executives leaned back in their leather chairs with relieved smiles, grateful that Victor had finally found someone lower on the food chain to absorb the humiliation that had been hanging over all of them for the last hour. The chief financial officer smirked into his coffee. The logistics vice president folded his arms. Even the junior analysts, men young enough to still fear student loan payments, exchanged amused glances as if the morning had suddenly turned entertaining. Claire slowly lifted her eyes from the laptop screen. Her face remained calm, but there was something in her expression Victor did not recognize, not fear, not embarrassment, and certainly not submission. It was the quiet concentration of someone who had not been listening to the insults at all. Victor tilted his head. "Well," he said. "Do not let us interrupt your brilliance." More laughter. Claire closed her laptop with deliberate care and placed both hands on the table. "Actually," she said softly, "I think I found something." The room changed, but only slightly at first. The laughter did not disappear. It thinned into scattered chuckles, the kind people use when they expect the next few seconds to become painfully awkward for someone else. Victor smiled the way wealthy men smile when they are about to enjoy a spectacle. "You found something," he repeated. "That is fantastic. Because my executive team, all with degrees from places that cost more than most homes in this country, has apparently found nothing. Please enlighten us." Claire stood. The chair legs made a small scraping sound against the marble floor, somehow louder than it should have been. She picked up a packet of printed shipping summaries left near the center of the table and walked forward. No rush. No trembling hands. Just a woman in a gray cardigan crossing a room full of million-dollar egos as though she had crossed rooms like this many times before. Victor stepped aside with theatrical courtesy and gestured toward the giant wall monitor. "By all means, Ms. Whitman. Save the empire." A few people laughed again, but this time less confidently. Claire connected her old laptop to the presentation cable. For 3 long seconds, the monitor stayed black. Someone coughed. Someone whispered, "This should be good." Then rows of distribution maps appeared across the wall, followed by shipping percentages, warehouse scans, and route completion rates from 6 continents. Claire zoomed in on one narrow column buried inside the Southeast Asia transit reports. "Everyone is looking at the delayed ports," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that the room had to lean in. "That is why everyone is missing the trigger." Victor folded his arms, amused. "And what exactly is the trigger?" Claire pointed to a number highlighted in yellow. This reroute compression ratio was adjusted 8 months ago during the software migration. The vice president of logistics frowned. That change was minimal. Claire nodded. 0.08% minimal. Several executives gave dismissive shrugs. Victor smirked. "You interrupted a billion-dollar emergency meeting over less than 0.1%. Claire clicked again. The next slide appeared, and this time several faces stiffened. "Yes," she said. "Because that 0.1% forced every high-volume shipment through secondary hubs during peak customs windows, which created hidden delays that compounded every 48 hours. That backlog triggered automatic penalties in your retail contracts, overbooked warehouse labor, and caused your overseas clients to redirect inventory to competitors." The room grew quieter. Claire zoomed out, and the tiny yellow decimal became a branching web of red lines spreading across the global map like a silent infection. "This company is not losing $100 million because the ports failed," she continued. "This company is losing $100 million because your internal routing logic has been choking itself for 8 months. No one laugh now." Victor's smile held for a second too long, then began to fade. The chief financial officer sat upright. One analyst reached for his calculator. Claire turned one final page, and her eye settled not on the executives, but directly on Victor Langford. "And according to the approval archive," she said, "the reroute compression change was personally authorized by your office." The room went completely silent. For a moment, nobody in that gleaming boardroom seemed to remember how to breathe. Victor Langford remained at the head of the table, shoulders squared, but the absolute authority he had worn like a custom suit only minutes earlier developed its first visible crack. His eyes moved to the approval code projected on the wall, then back to Claire, then again to the screen, as if repetition might somehow change what everyone had just seen. It did not. The approval stamp carried his executive signature, dated 8 months earlier, during the celebrated software restructuring he had personally announced to shareholders as the future of Langford Global Holdings. The chief financial officer cleared his throat. "That cannot be the only factor," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire clicked to the next data layer. "It is not the only factor," she replied. "It is the initiating factor." Once the compression ratio rerouted premium cargo into secondary customs lanes, the delay penalties multiplied automatically under your vendor contracts. Every missed scan triggered labor overtime. Every overtime trigger raised warehouse handling fees. Every handling fee lowered margin confidence, which forced emergency discounting. She tapped another key. Numbers cascaded down the wall in clean white columns. Delays. Penalties. Lost retailer confidence. Investor exposure. The total reached $103.6 million. No dramatic music was needed. The arithmetic was humiliation enough. Victor stepped closer to the monitor. "This model is theoretical," he said sharply. "You are building assumptions." Claire shook her head. "No, sir. I am building chronology." She enlarged the timestamps. One by one, every red loss marker aligned with the same routing update authorized by his office. A senior analyst whispered an involuntary, "My God." The logistics vice president grabbed his own reports and began flipping pages with growing panic. The Harvard consultant who had spent 40 minutes blaming foreign ports suddenly stopped writing. The room was no longer judging Claire Whitman. The room was recalculating Victor Langford. Victor turned toward the executives, expecting someone, anyone, to challenge her. None of them did. Men who had laughed at the quiet woman near the coffee station were now avoiding eye contact with the billionaire at the head of the table. That was the first real reversal of the morning. Wealth had not moved. Titles had not changed. But confidence had shifted sides. Victor forced a thin smile. "Interesting analysis," he said, each word clipped. "Even if I accepted that this update caused the backlog, identifying the leak does not solve the loss." He faced Claire with renewed condescension, clinging to the last branch of superiority he could still reach. "Can you do more than point fingers, Ms. Whitman, or is this where your little presentation ends?" Several people glanced at Claire, waiting to see whether she would retreat now that she had made her point. Instead, she reached for the wireless clicker with the same calm motion she had used to close her laptop. "I did not come forward to explain the fire," she said. "I came forward because it can still be put out." Heads lifted. The chief financial officer lowered his pen. Even Victor's expression tightened. Claire switched to a fresh dashboard no one in the company had seen before, a live simulation built from warehouse throughput, customs windows, and retailer priority codes. Blue lines replaced the red chaos. If the routing tree is reopened and premium inventory is reassigned through direct coastal hubs within the next 48 hours, 62% of delayed contracts can be recovered before breach clauses activate. She clicked again. If labor scheduling is reversed and warehouse scanning is moved to predictive batch release, the company avoids another $14 million in overtime waste by Friday. Another click. And if overseas inventory is reoffered through domestic partners instead of waiting on default transit, you do not lose $100 million. She paused. Every face in the room fixed on the final projection loading onto the screen. The number appeared in green. Plus 170 per million. Dollars in retained and accelerated revenue. A hush fell so suddenly it felt physical. Victor Langford stared at the wall as though the building itself had betrayed him. The woman he had mocked 10 minutes earlier had not only diagnosed the catastrophe. She had just shown the room she could turn it into profit. The green revenue projection stayed on the wall like a verdict no one wanted to read twice. 170 per million dollars. Retained. Recoverable. Real. The executives who had spent the last 90 minutes shifting blame now looked as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath them. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses and leaned so close to the screen that his reflection blurred across the numbers. The logistics vice president began muttering dates under his breath, checking Claire's sequence against his own shipping logs. Every route matched. Every customs delay matched. Every labor overcharge matched. There was no theatrical flourish in what Claire had done, and that made it more devastating. She had not guessed. She had not improvised. She had simply understood the system better than the people who were paid millions to run it. Victor Langford slowly turned from the wall monitor. His face had lost the polished confidence that usually made investors trust him without question. In its place was something far less familiar to a billionaire who controlled headlines and board votes with a phone call. Uncertainty. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. The question hung in the air with almost embarrassing sincerity. It was the first time that morning he had spoken to Claire without mockery. Claire met his stare evenly. "Temporary operations consultant," she answered. A few executives shifted awkwardly, because everyone in the room knew that title no longer fit what they were witnessing. Victor narrowed his eyes. "No. I mean before that." Claire hesitated for only a second. "Before that, I spent 11 years designing adaptive freight systems for North American retail chains." The chief financial officer blinked. "With who?" Claire clicked open one final document. 3 corporate logos appeared across the wall. Horizon Freight. Analytics. Westline Consumer Distribution. Mercer International Logistics. The room reacted in a wave of visible recognition. Those were not mid-level firms. Those were the companies every executive in that room studied in business school because their distribution models had rewritten modern shipping efficiency. The logistics vice president looked stunned. "Those systems were built by a team led by C. Whitman," he said slowly, almost to himself. Claire nodded once. "Yes." A hush fell over the boardroom so deep that even the rain against the windows seemed louder. Victor's jaw tightened. "You are Claire Whitman." For the first time all morning, several people looked at her not as the woman in the cardigan, but as a name they had unknowingly cited in presentations for years. The invisible consultant by the coffee station suddenly had a professional shadow larger than every title around that table. Claire folded her hands calmly. "I retired after my husband passed away," she said. "I came back to consulting part-time 6 months ago." Quietly. No one spoke. There was something almost painful in the executives' expressions now, because memory was catching up with them. The ignored emails. The reports she had submitted. The meetings she was never invited to speak in. The assumptions made because she arrived without designer labels or a corner office. Victor inhaled slowly, trying to regain control of a room that no longer belonged entirely to him. "If you had this expertise," he said, "why did you not say something sooner?" Claire's answer came without heat, which somehow made it cut deeper. "I did." She reached into her folder and placed 3 printed memos on the conference table. Each one carried routing concerns, projected penalty warnings, and recommended structural corrections. Each one had been submitted over the last 2 weeks through internal review channels. Each one bore the same notation stamped in blue by executive administration. Deferred pending leadership approval. The chief financial officer looked down. The logistics vice president looked away. Victor did not move. Claire continued in that same level tone. "I was not silent because I had nothing to say, Mr. Langford. I was silent because no one in this room thought the quiet woman near the coffee station was worth hearing." The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Several executives visibly lowered their heads. Victor stared at the deferred memos as if they were written in a language he no longer understood. For a billionaire who had spent his life believing authority guaranteed intelligence, this was a more expensive lesson than $100 million. No one rushed to defend themselves. That was perhaps the most revealing part of what happened next. In corporations like Langford Global Holdings, executives were trained to speak instantly, to redirect blame before silence could harden into liability. But this silence was different. It had weight. It had shame. 3 deferred memos lay in the center of the conference table like quiet witnesses, and every polished leader around that marble monument suddenly looked much smaller than the titles printed on their business cards. Victor Langford picked up the top memo. His fingers, usually steady enough to negotiate acquisitions worth billions, tightened around the paper as he scanned Claire's recommendations line by line. Dynamic hub redistribution. Predictive customs staggering. Priority lane bypass sequencing. They were not vague observations. They were complete solutions. Dated. Submitted. Ignored. Victor flipped to the second memo. Same warning. Same urgency. Same executive stamp. Deferred. By the third memo, the color had visibly drained from his face. He looked up slowly, first at the chief financial officer, then at the logistics vice president, then at the executive administrator seated halfway down the table. Why, he asked, and his voice had become dangerously quiet, did these never reach me? No one answered immediately. The executive administrator swallowed hard. Sir, they were categorized as consultant recommendations requiring departmental review before escalation. Victor's stare sharpened. And departmental review means what exactly? The logistics vice president shifted in his chair. It means they are usually filtered through senior leadership for relevance. Claire said nothing. She did not need to. The words filtered through senior leadership translated themselves in every mind present. The memos had been dismissed because they came from someone no one considered important enough to interrupt executives. A woman without a corner office. Without a luxury watch. Without the social performance of authority. Victor set the papers down with slow precision. So while this company bled over $100 million, he said, the only workable solution sat in an administrative pile because none of you thought a temporary consultant deserved 10 minutes of attention. The chief financial officer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no elegant defense against arithmetic and paper trails. Victor turned back to Claire, and for the first time the billionaire looked almost unsettled by her composure. She was not triumphant. Not smug. Not vindictive. She simply stood there with the same stillness she had carried all morning, as though this outcome had been inevitable from the moment no one bothered to listen. How long would implementation take? Victor asked. Claire glanced at the simulation. If I have direct authority over routing, warehouse release, and customs override approvals, I can stabilize the domestic chain in 12 hours and begin overseas recovery by tomorrow afternoon. The chief financial officer nearly jolted upright. Tomorrow afternoon? Claire nodded. Assuming no one slows the process with committee meetings. A few executives looked down, because everyone knew Langford Global loved committee meetings the way frightened people love delay. Victor stared at her another second, measuring something beyond credentials now. He was measuring control. The room had begun this morning believing Victor held all of it. But control had quietly migrated to the woman no one had allowed near the main table. You would need full executive clearance, the logistics vice president said cautiously. Claire turned toward him. Then give it. The directness of those 2 words hit the room harder than shouting ever could have. This was no longer the apologetic consultant trying to be heard through corporate layers. This was the architect of the only viable rescue plan speaking in the language competence naturally earns. Victor inhaled deeply. Every eye shifted to him. Billionaires are not accustomed to moments where authority demands humility, because humility feels too much like surrender. Yet the market would open in less than 2 hours. Investors would call. Clients would panic. And the only person standing between Langford Global and public disaster was the same quiet woman he had called sweetheart in front of his board. Victor Langford straightened, but the arrogance was gone now, stripped away by spreadsheets, timestamps, and consequences. Fine, he said at last. You have full clearance. Claire held his gaze. Then she asked the question that made several executives stop blinking. Including clearance to override your office if necessary. The room froze again. The question hung over the boardroom with a kind of surgical precision. Including clearance to override your office if necessary. Several executives visibly stiffened, because everyone in that room understood what Claire Whitman had just done. She had not asked for permission to help. She had asked for authority to bypass the very ego that created the crisis. For a billionaire accustomed to final say on every floor of this building, that request was not procedural. It was personal. Victor Langford stared at her, and for 3 long seconds the rain tapping against the windows was the only sound anyone heard. His jaw flexed. The chief financial officer shifted as if he expected Victor to explode, or at the very least reassert dominance with some polished executive rebuke. But this was no longer a room where dominance came from volume. It came from whoever had the answer. Claire had that answer. Everyone knew it. Victor knew it most painfully of all. Yes, he said at last. The single word landed like a dropped gavel. A few heads turned sharply toward him in disbelief. Victor Langford, the man who once made vice presidents wait outside his office for 40 minutes just to prove a point, had just handed unrestricted operational authority to the quiet consultant in the grey cardigan. Claire gave one small nod, not triumphant, simply efficient. Then she moved. The transformation was immediate. The woman who had spent the morning near the coffee station became the center of motion in a room full of frozen executives. She stepped to the head of the conference table and turned the main monitor into a live command dashboard. I need direct lines open to Seattle, Newark, Houston, and Savannah port coordinators, she said. I need customs compliance officers on speaker in Singapore and Rotterdam within 15 minutes. I need warehouse labor managers from all Midwest facilities, and I need every routing administrator logged in to override access now. Her voice was still calm, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who expected to be obeyed. And they obeyed. Phones came out. Assistants were summoned. Laptops snapped open. The same executives who had laughed when Victor mocked her were now scribbling notes while trying to keep up. Claire pointed to the logistics vice president. Cancel all secondary hub sequencing effective immediately. She turned to the chief financial officer. Freeze non-essential labor approval and redirect budget to overnight scanning teams. To executive administration, no committee review. No memo chain. If a request has my name on it, it moves. The boardroom had become a command center, but more striking than the activity was the speed with which everyone accepted her leadership. Competence has a gravity arrogance can never manufacture. Within minutes, giant status windows began filling the wall monitor. Port confirmations. Warehouse acknowledgements. Customs queue responses. Claire processed each update without wasted language. Houston rerouted. Good. Newark, hold premium textiles for direct lane release. Savannah, bypass standard retail staging. She was not asking. She was orchestrating. Victor stood half a step behind her, silent, watching his own empire respond faster to this woman in 20 minutes than it had responded to his executives in 8 months. The realization seemed to age him in real time. One analyst whispered to another, how did no one know who she was? But Claire heard it. Because no one asked, she said without looking away from the screen. The sentence made the whispering stop. Another update flashed green. Then another. Delayed contracts reopened. Warehouse congestion dropping. Client alerts paused. The red crisis map that had dominated the wall all morning began slowly converting to blue operational flow. It was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was something far more satisfying. Order replacing incompetence in measurable increments. The chief financial officer stared at the improving revenue model and murmured, almost reverently, this is actually working. Claire typed one final override and sent it through the system. It was always going to work, she said. The data was never the problem. Victor looked at her. Then what was? Claire finally turned from the screen and faced him fully. Around them, phones still rang and assistants still hurried, but the boardroom itself seemed to tighten into stillness again. Her eyes were steady. Her voice never rose. The problem, Mr. Langford, was that everyone here trusted hierarchy more than intelligence. No one in that room could argue with her, because every improving number on the wall was proving she was right. By 11:15 that morning, the impossible had become visible in numbers. The wall monitor that had opened the day in flashing red alerts now showed contract recoveries ticking upward in green, one retailer after another removing breach notifications, one customs hub after another confirming priority clearance. Seattle stabilized first. Newark followed 7 minutes later. Houston cut warehouse congestion by nearly 40% before lunch. Every update that appeared on the giant screen struck the room with the same quiet force. Claire Whitman had been right. More than right. She had been indispensable. The chief financial officer was the first to stop pretending this was merely impressive. He leaned back slowly, staring at the live revenue line climbing away from disaster. "We're going to recover this," he said, almost as if saying it aloud would help him believe it. No one answered him, because everyone was watching Claire. She moved from terminal to terminal with calm efficiency, approving reroutes, rejecting redundant reviews, redirecting labor blocks, speaking to port coordinators in language so precise it sounded less like conversation and more like engineering. There was no wasted motion, no inflated corporate jargon, no need to remind anyone she was in charge. The room had accepted that fact completely now. Even executive assistants who had ignored her in the hallway for weeks were rushing documents directly into her hands. Victor Langford remained near the head of the table, but the symbolism was impossible to miss. He still stood in the billionaire's position. She held the billionaire's control. Another green notification flashed. European textile accounts reopened at partial margin. The chief financial officer let out a breath he had clearly been holding for hours. Investor panic will slow if this trend holds through market close. Claire did not look up. It will hold if no one interferes. The sentence was neutral, but several executives lowered their eyes anyway. Victor watched her for a long moment. "You really submitted all of this in memos?" he asked. Claire nodded while typing. 3 formal memos. 2 departmental alerts. 1 direct email request for review. The executive administrator shifted uncomfortably. Victor's face hardened, not with anger this time, but with something closer to embarrassment. Men like Victor were not accustomed to being made to feel small by silence and paperwork. Yet that was exactly what was happening. Not because Claire was attacking him. Because she was outperforming every assumption he had built the morning on. At 11:23, Claire ended a call with Rotterdam Customs and finally stepped back from the monitor. "Domestic recovery path is locked," she said. "International chain should clear by tomorrow if labor execution remains disciplined." The room did not erupt in applause. This was not that kind of room. What happened instead was stranger and far more meaningful. People who had spent their careers interrupting one another simply sat there, looking at her, as if recalibrating how they understood competence itself. The logistics vice president, a man who had mocked consultant reports for years, stood up first. "Ms. Whitman," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology." Claire looked at him but said nothing. He swallowed. "I reviewed your first memo myself. I marked it low priority." His admission seemed to unlock something. The chief financial officer removed his glasses. "I signed the second deferment." The executive administrator spoke next. "I never forwarded the direct review request." One by one, the polished hierarchy of Langford Global Holdings began confessing not crimes, but something more corporate and more common, reflexive dismissal. The assumption that relevance comes dressed in expensive fabric. The assumption that quiet means incapable. Claire listened without expression. She did not ask for apologies. She did not rescue them from their discomfort. She simply let the truth sit where everyone could feel it. Finally Victor Langford stepped forward. The billionaire who had entered this room throwing reports and sarcasm now looked at the woman in the grey cardigan with none of the superiority left. "Claire," he said, and even hearing him use her first name made several executives glance up, "I misjudged you." Claire closed the final dashboard window. The red crisis map was gone now, replaced entirely by blue operational flow. Then she looked at Victor with the same calm eyes that had unsettled him all morning. "No," she said quietly. "You judged exactly what you chose to see." The room went silent again, because everyone knew that was worse. Victor Langford had built his career on commanding rooms, but there is a peculiar loneliness that comes when command no longer guarantees respect. He stood there surrounded by executives, analysts, assistants, and glowing monitors filled with recovering numbers, yet for the first time in years he looked like the least certain person on the 42nd floor. Claire Whitman, meanwhile, simply unplugged her laptop cable from the main screen as if this had been any ordinary assignment. No flourish. No speech. No hunger for recognition. That unsettled the room more than if she had demanded applause. People understand anger. They understand revenge. What they rarely know how to process is quiet. Competence with no need for validation. The chief financial officer cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitman," he said, "the board will want a full presentation this afternoon. We should discuss your long-term role here." Claire slid her old laptop into its worn leather bag. "There is no need." Several heads lifted. Victor frowned. "No need." Claire shook her head. "My contract was for systems reconciliation. The systems are now stable." Victor stepped closer. "Claire, I do not think you understand. You just saved this company." She looked at him with almost gentle patience, the kind usually reserved for someone arriving late to an obvious truth. "No, Mr. Langford," she said. "I saved your company this morning. That is not the same thing as wanting to belong to it." The sentence landed with the same clean force every one of her observations seemed to carry. Victor opened his mouth, then stopped. He was a billionaire. He knew how to buy consultants, executives, lawyers, and loyalty. But there was something in Claire's tone that made money suddenly feel clumsy. The chief financial officer tried again. "We can discuss compensation. Equity. Executive placement." Claire smiled faintly, not insulted, just unsurprised. Compensation was never the issue. She reached into her folder and placed a slim envelope on the conference table beside the deferred memos. Victor stared at it. "What is that?" Claire answered, "My resignation." The room reacted in a visible wave. The logistics vice president blinked hard. One analyst actually whispered, "She is leaving," as if the possibility had not occurred to anyone. Of course it had not. Powerful people often assume that once they finally recognize value, value will wait gratefully to be chosen. Claire had no such interest. Victor picked up the envelope but did not open it. "You're resigning today?" Claire nodded. "I submitted it to Human Resources at 8:10 this morning." Victor looked genuinely confused. "Before this meeting?" "Yes." Claire adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I had already decided." A hush fell over the boardroom, because everyone sensed there was one final lesson still unfolding and none of them were going to enjoy where it landed. Victor stared at her. "Why?" Claire's eyes moved slowly across the conference table, over the executives now avoiding her gaze, over the assistants who had learned her name only in crisis, over the polished architecture of a company that rewarded volume and ignored substance. "Because competence should not have to wait for catastrophe to be respected," she said. "And I have spent enough years in rooms where people only listen after they are frightened." No one wrote that down. No one interrupted. Some truths are too accurate to survive corporate language. Victor's grip tightened on the resignation envelope. "You are making a mistake," he said, but his voice no longer carried authority. It carried something rarer. Regret. Claire gave him one small, sad smile. "No, Mr. Langford. The mistake was made long before I stood up today. She turned toward the boardroom doors. The giant monitor behind her still displayed rising green recovery numbers, every single one a monument to what she had done in less than 3 hours. Yet the woman responsible for saving $170 million was walking away with the same old laptop, the same grey cardigan, and no visible interest in hearing anyone finally call her brilliant. Victor took one involuntary step forward. Claire. She paused, her hand on the polished metal handle, but she did not turn around. When Victor spoke again, the billionaire who had mocked her near the coffee station sounded like a man hearing his own failure in real time. What am I supposed to tell the board when they ask why the most capable person in this building just walked out? Claire answered without looking back. Tell them the truth. She was here the whole time, and you chose not to see her. The boardroom doors closed softly behind Claire Whitman, yet the sound seemed louder than any speech Victor Langford had given in that room for the last decade. No one moved for several seconds. The green recovery numbers still climbed across the giant wall monitor, contract stabilizing, investor exposure shrinking, warehouse flow returning to normal, but all of that now felt secondary to the uncomfortable truth. Sitting at the center of the marble table, Langford Global Holdings had not nearly collapsed because of foreign ports, software failure, or labor inefficiency. It had nearly collapsed because an entire leadership culture had become blind to quiet intelligence. Victor remained staring at the closed door, Claire's resignation envelope still in his hand. Billionaires are surrounded by people who tell them yes so often that eventually they begin to mistake obedience for wisdom. This morning had corrected that illusion in the most expensive way possible. The chief financial officer finally spoke, though even his voice sounded smaller. Sir, the New York investors will be on the line in 20 minutes. Victor did not answer. He looked down at the deferred memos, then at the green numbers, then back at the door again. There was no market report capable of softening what he understood now. The company had been saved, yes. But the person who saved it had chosen to leave rather than stay where she had only become visible during disaster. That realization was not just embarrassing. It was indicting. Victor slowly opened Claire's resignation envelope. Inside was a single type page, dated that morning, 8:10 a.m. No dramatic complaint. No list of grievances. Just a brief formal notice and one final sentence at the bottom. I have learned that systems can be repaired faster than assumptions. Victor read that line twice. Then a third time. The chief financial officer watched him carefully. What does it say? Victor folded the letter and set it down. It says we built a company that knows how to measure revenue, he answered quietly, but forgot how to measure people. No one challenged him, because no one in that room had the moral footing left to do so. Outside the glass walls, the rain over Chicago had begun to clear. Thin sunlight touched the skyline, reflecting off steel and windows in pale strips of silver. Inside, assistants resumed moving, phones resumed ringing, and market logistics resumed their normal frantic rhythm. The corporation was alive again. Yet the room itself felt permanently altered, as though some invisible architecture of arrogance had cracked. And would never quite fit together the same way. Victor walked slowly back to the head chair he had occupied with such certainty earlier that morning, but he did not sit. Instead, he looked at each executive in turn. Men and women with elite degrees, elite salaries, elite offices. Effective immediately, he said, all consultant recommendations bypass departmental filtering and come directly to executive review. No title-based suppression. No deferred memo chain without written justification. Several people nodded quickly. Victor continued. And every leader on this floor will spend the next month reviewing every ignored internal report submitted by staff outside senior management. The logistics vice president blinked. Every report. Victor's eyes hardened. Every report. The message was clear. He was not trying to recover shipping lanes anymore. He was trying to recover humility, though humility inside institutions often arrives only after humiliation has done its work. At 12:07, Victor finally sat down, but the billionaire looked older now, Not in years, in certainty. He glanced once more at the closed boardroom doors and imagined the quiet woman in the grey cardigan stepping into the elevator with her worn laptop bag, leaving behind a company worth billions that had discovered